Past midnight, the maid heard a woman's voice hiss behind the door at the end of the hall, followed by the faint sound of a hand slapping weakly against a bed frame, the only cry for help a girl who had lost her voice could ever make. Ruth Delaney pushed the door open. The master's fiancé was leaning over his younger sister, her tone sweet as honey yet cold as ice. "Go ahead, make your little signs. You can't even make a sound, so who would ever believe you?" In her hand was Nora's medicine bottle, and she had just set it down on the table, turned the wrong way from how Ruth had arranged it earlier that evening. On the bed, Nora curled in on herself, her lips slowly turning blue, her wide eyes locked onto Ruth, screaming something her throat could never put into words. Ruth pulled out her phone. One call to the most powerful man at the harbor was about to tear apart the mask an entire family had trusted for months. But what no one saw coming was that the person who would pay the highest price tonight was not the one who had just been exposed. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and share it so it can reach even more people. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next story that moves you. That afternoon, a few hours before darkness settled over the mansion by the harbor, Wesley Kane stood in the middle of warehouse number 7, with both hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, silently looking at the man kneeling before him. His name was Briggs, a middle-ranking henchman in Wesley's loading operation, a man who had just been caught red-handed extorting wages from an old dock worker who had worked at this harbor for nearly 30 years. The old man, Foster, stood pressed into a corner of the wall, his trembling hands clutching his worn cloth cap, a thin line of blood seeping from the corner of his mouth because of the slap Briggs had delivered when he dared to refuse to hand over that unreasonable cut of money. The whole warehouse had fallen deathly still. No one dared to breathe too loudly. The men who had once made the entire harbor tremble now stood in a line with their eyes lowered, because they knew that when their boss remained silent for that long, his anger had already gone beyond the reach of words. Wesley walked over to old Foster first. He bent down, pulled a thick stack of money from inside his coat, placed it into the man's calloused palm, then said in a low, slow voice that from this day forward, no one would ever dare touch a single dollar of his again. The old man looked up, his eyes, clouded with age, suddenly filling with tears, his mouth stammering words of gratitude that couldn't quite become a sentence. Wesley only gave a single nod, then turned toward Briggs. He didn't shout. He didn't raise a hand. He only looked at the man with eyes so cold that Briggs felt his spine turn to stone. Wesley said that in this city, there was one law every man who entered his organization had to carve into his bones, and that was that the strong were never allowed to lay a hand on someone weaker than themselves for profit. He said that any man who stole money from an old man bent under the weight of earning his daily bread didn't deserve to stand under his command, and he deserved even less to call himself a man. Briggs opened his mouth to beg, but Wesley had already signaled to the 2 nearest guards. They hauled Briggs to his feet and dragged him out of the warehouse under the silent gaze of everyone left behind. Wesley didn't need to say what the punishment would be. Everyone in the harbor understood that being cast out of Kane's organization meant losing every place of protection, and a man like Briggs would have nowhere left to take shelter anywhere in this region. That was how Wesley Kane punished people, without noise, without staining his hands, but with a decisiveness cold enough to chill the blood. When the crowd dispersed, he remained standing alone in the vast warehouse, the afternoon sunlight piercing through the high window slits and laying pale gold streaks across the concrete floor. People called him the most powerful man on the harbor, the man who owned half of the city's underground transportation network, the man whose name even old families spoke with caution. But in that rare moment of stillness, the only thing that rose in Wesley's mind wasn't money or status, but the pale face of his younger sister recovering at home. Nora was the only blood relative he had left after their parents died, the only person in this world he truly wanted to protect. And yet work kept pulling him away from morning until night, from one negotiation to another confrontation, leaving him for weeks at a time unable to sit beside her bed for more than a few minutes. He told himself he was doing all of this for her, because he wanted to build a wall strong enough that no power could ever reach Nora. He didn't know that the wall he had worked so hard to build already had a crack in it, and that crack was inside his own house, wearing the gentle face of the woman he was about to marry. Wesley pulled out his phone, intending to call home and ask about his sister, as he still tried to do every afternoon. But just then, a subordinate hurried over to report that urgent business required him at the eastern dock at once. He hesitated for 1 second, glanced at the screen, then slipped the phone back into his pocket with a silent promise that tonight he would absolutely come home early. He had no idea that tonight would be the fateful night he'd never forget for the rest of his life. The Kane mansion stood on the hill overlooking the harbor, vast and silent like the man who owned it. And in the brightest room on the second floor, Nora Kane was lying propped against her pillows, her thin hands resting neatly on the light blanket. That 19-year-old girl had just endured a fever that had lasted nearly 2 weeks. A fever whose complications had made her already fragile heart even more unsteady, forcing the family's private doctor to repeat again and again that she needed to take her medicine on time and absolutely avoid any strong emotional shock. Nora couldn't speak, and she had never been able to speak since the day she was born, but her eyes knew how to tell stories in a way very few people were willing to listen to. She communicated with the world through an old phone her brother had given her, typing out each line and holding it up in front of the person facing her, or through small hand signs that only a few familiar people understood. To Nora, that phone wasn't simply an object. It was her very voice, the only door that allowed her to step out of the silence surrounding her, and she always kept it beside her the way people cling to breath itself. The only person in the house who truly had the patience to read every one of those lines, who truly stopped long enough to understand what Nora wanted, was Ruth Delaney, the new maid who had been working there for less than half a year. Ruth was 27 years old, orphaned of both father and mother early in life, raised among cramped rented rooms and one hard labor job after another. She had once studied nursing with the dream of wearing a white nurse's coat, but that dream was cut short halfway when her mother became gravely ill, forcing her to leave school so she could care for her mother while working for hire to pay the hospital bills. And in the end, her mother still passed away, leaving Ruth with a debt and a heart that had grown far too familiar with loss. It was those years of lowering her head in service and witnessing the powerless being trampled that taught Ruth a particular instinct, the ability to see the pain hidden behind another person's silence. When she was hired into the Kane household and stepped into Nora's room for the first time, she didn't look at that girl as a sick young lady who needed to be served, but as a human being longing for someone to listen. Ruth learned to read Nora's signs, patiently waited for her to finish typing a line no matter how long it took, and sometimes simply sat quietly beside the bed so Nora would know she wasn't alone. Between those two young women, both carrying uncertain and fragile fates, a quiet yet steadfast affection began to bloom, the kind of bond that didn't need words to be warm. But inside that vast house, there was another woman, and her presence was like a cold wind slipping through a crack in the door. Celeste Vance, Wesley's fiancée, was a beautiful woman with a smile that always appeared at exactly the right moment, and a voice that turned sweet in exactly the right places. Whenever Wesley was home, Celeste transformed into the perfect image of a future wife, thoughtfully asking after Nora, gently stroking the girl's hair, tenderly reminding the staff to bring hot porridge up to the room. Wesley watched those scenes with relief in his heart, believing he had chosen a woman who knew how to love his family, a woman who would care for his sister in his place whenever he was busy. But Ruth, with eyes that had grown used to seeing through layers of disguise, recognized that there was something unreal inside that tenderness. She noticed that Celeste's smile vanished the instant Wesley turned his back. She noticed the way Celeste's gaze slid over Nora with a coldness that was hard to name. She noticed that every time Nora tried to type something on her phone in front of Celeste, the woman would find a way to brush it aside or seize the attention back toward herself. Ruth didn't yet know exactly what was hidden behind it all, but the instinct of someone who had tasted enough bitterness told her that beneath this splendid roof, some seed of danger was quietly growing, waiting for the day it would burst open into disaster. During the weeks Nora lay recovering, more than once she tried to tell her brother the truth of what was happening behind his back, but every time, she collided with the invisible wall of her own silence. One rare evening, Wesley came home early. He sat down on the edge of his sister's bed, and Nora immediately clutched at his sleeve, her eyes wide with urgency, her trembling hand pointing toward the door where Celeste had just disappeared. She tried to type as quickly as she could on the phone screen, but her frail fingers, still weakened after the illness, kept slipping, and before she could finish typing one complete sentence, Celeste had already returned to the room with a tray of fruit in her hands, a gentle smile already resting on her lips. She softly set the tray down, sat on the other side of the bed, then told Wesley in a voice filled with sympathy that Nora had been feeling unwell lately, that every afternoon she became restless and irritable, perhaps because she had been lying in one place for too long and her mood had become unstable, so he shouldn't take the girl's erratic gestures to heart. Hearing that, Wesley nodded. He took his sister's hand and comforted her, telling her not to push herself too hard, to rest until she was stronger, and then she could tell him anything she wanted. Nora looked at him, her throat choking around a cry that would never be able to escape, and all she could do was helplessly let go of his sleeve, her eyes brimming with tears from the feeling of standing right in front of the person she loved most in the world and still being unable to reach him. The times that followed all ended the same way. When Nora tried to signal with her hands, Celeste would say the girl was tired and waving them around meaninglessly. When Nora struggled to write something out, Celeste would find a way to interrupt at exactly the right moment, sometimes pretending to worry and taking the phone away because she feared Nora would hurt her eyes by using the screen, sometimes skillfully steering the conversation in another direction before Wesley could finish reading the unfinished line. Wesley, already so used to the slow and difficult way his sister communicated, and at the same time being pulled into 100 duties at the harbor, never once imagined that behind Nora's erratic gestures was a desperate cry for help. He only saw that his sister was often agitated, often on the verge of tears, and he blamed it all on the lingering illness, on the long days of confinement in a sickbed. He didn't know that every time he gently told her to rest and then left the room, Nora's small heart broke a little more. The only person who began to sense that something was wrong in that room was Ruth. She noticed that every time Celeste appeared at the exact moment Nora was about to tell her brother something important, the coincidence repeated itself so often that it no longer felt like a coincidence. She noticed that after every time Wesley left, Nora's shoulders would slump, and the girl would often lie turned toward the wall for a long while, 2 streams of tears silently soaking into her pillow. She noticed that on some days, Nora gripped the phone in her hand so tightly that her knuckles turned white, as though she were holding on to a secret she had no way to give away. One afternoon, when only the 2 of them were left in the room, Ruth gently sat down and asked the girl whether there was something she wanted to tell her brother but hadn't been able to say. Nora snapped her head up, her eyes blazing with a fierce spark of hope. She nodded again and again, her lips moving in vain, then reached out and tried to type on the phone. But at that very moment, Celeste's footsteps sounded in the hallway, and Nora immediately hurried to hide the phone beneath the blanket, her whole body going rigid with fear. In that instant, Ruth understood that the girl's fear was real, that the person who made her hide things and tremble like that wasn't some stranger, but the very woman who was about to become her sister-in-law. The instinct in Ruth's heart shifted from something vague into a clear and growing worry, and she told herself that she would have to watch even more closely what was happening behind the door of the room at the end of the hall. That night settled over the mansion with an unusual stillness, and when the great clock in the hall struck 9, Wesley received an urgent call from the Eastern Dock, reporting that there was an important shipment he needed to handle in person before the night was over. He stood on the staircase, hesitating as he looked toward the hallway that led to his sister's room, a vague guilt rising in his chest that he couldn't quite name. Before leaving, he stopped by Nora's room, bent down to tell his sister to try to sleep well, and promised that when he came home the next morning, he would sit with her for a long while. He also turned to Celeste, who was standing quietly nearby with her familiar, gentle expression, and asked her to look after Nora for him that night. Celeste smiled and nodded, placing a hand over her chest with a sweet promise that he could rest assured she would care for the girl as if Nora were her own sister. Wesley looked into those eyes and felt his heart ease, never imagining that the smile he had just seen would vanish the moment the sound of his car engine disappeared beyond the iron gate. As soon as the convoy rolled out onto the sloping road leading down to the harbor, the house sank into silence, and Celeste's true face began to emerge in the darkness. She wasn't in a hurry, and she wasn't flustered, because she had been waiting for this moment for a long time, and had calculated every move with a coldness frightening enough to chill the bone. She knew very well that Nora's fragile heart, after the fever, now depended completely on the pills placed on the small table beside her bed. The pills the private doctor had repeatedly instructed must be taken at the proper dose and at the proper time, or the consequences would be impossible to predict. And that very dependence had become the fatal opening Celeste intended to strike. She walked into Nora's room at an unhurried pace, carrying a medicine bottle that looked exactly like the girl's, except that the pills inside had been replaced with ones of the wrong dosage, a medicine that looked no different on the outside, but was strong enough to push a weakening heart into danger. She sat down on the edge of the bed, looked at Nora with eyes that no longer held even the smallest pretense of warmth, then picked up the real bottle from the table and silently switched it with the altered one. Nora lay in bed and witnessed everything, her eyes widening in horror. She understood at once what this woman was doing, and she struggled to sit up, her hands reaching desperately as she tried to snatch back the real bottle, her mouth opening around a cry that would remain forever silent. But her body, barely past the illness, was far too weak, and Celeste only had to lightly hold her wrist to make every effort at resistance hopeless. She leaned close and whispered into the girl's ear, in a voice that was at once the sweetest and the cruelest, telling her not to waste her strength, that no matter how she thrashed, by morning everyone would only see a sick girl whose condition had worsened and who had passed away because of her own weak heart. A death so natural that no one would suspect the slightest thing. She said it was time for the burden named Nora to be lifted from her life, so that her path into the Kane family would be wide open and no longer held back by any obstacle. Nora listened to every word as tears streamed down her face, not because she feared death, but because of the crushing helplessness of knowing that this horrifying truth would never reach her brother's ears. Celeste placed the fake medicine bottle back in the exact spot on the table, but in her haste as she let go of it, she turned it slightly out of position, with the label facing outward instead of inward, as Ruth always arranged it with careful precision every night. She paid no attention to that tiny detail, because in her eyes, how could a poor lowly maid ever be sharp enough to notice something so small? She straightened, smoothed the folds of her dress, and prepared to let her final, poisonous words fall over the girl curled up on the bed, not knowing that in the dark hallway outside, a figure had stopped before the half-closed door and was listening to every sound coming from inside the room. Ruth couldn't stand still for one more second. She shoved the door open and stepped straight into the room, cutting off the poisonous sentence still unfinished on Celeste's lips. The woman whipped around in shock, her face going pale for a fleeting instant at being caught. But in the blink of an eye, she recovered that false composure, curved her lips, and asked what kind of brazen maid dared barge into a room on her own in the middle of the night. Ruth didn't bother answering her, her eyes immediately fixed on Nora, who was curled up on the bed with blue-tinged lips and broken, uneven breaths. Then she looked toward the medicine bottle sitting at the wrong angle on the table, the tiny detail she had kept pinned in her mind all evening. In that instant, all the scattered pieces from so long before suddenly locked into place, and Ruth understood at once what had just happened. She rushed to the bedside and caught Nora's limp body, slipping one arm around the girl's shoulders to hold her upright so she could breathe more easily. Celeste stepped forward, intending to drag Ruth away, her voice sharpening as she ordered the maid to let go and get out of this room immediately, if she didn't want to lose her job. But Ruth lifted her head and looked straight into the woman's eyes with a firmness even she herself hadn't known she possessed. She said she had heard everything, seen everything, and she wouldn't let Celeste lay another finger on Nora. The two women struggled for a moment, Celeste trying to reach for the girl while Ruth shielded Nora with her whole body. And with a strength born from long-suppressed rage, Ruth managed to shove her back several steps, just enough time to gather Nora up and shift her to the other side of the bed near the door. Knowing she couldn't keep arguing with someone as dangerous and cunning as Celeste, Ruth decided to hold her ground inside this very room instead of risking carrying the girl out into a house full of servants when she didn't yet know who stood on whose side. She backed away, pulling Nora with her, then quickly slammed the inner bathroom door shut and turned the lock, keeping Celeste outside. Furious pounding struck the door, followed by Celeste's threats echoing in. But Ruth no longer had the mind to care, because all her attention now poured into the life fading in her arms. She propped Nora against the wall, knelt in front of her, and the unfinished nursing knowledge from years ago, which she had thought had long fallen asleep, suddenly came alive again in every movement of her hands. She placed a hand on Nora's chest and felt the girl's heartbeat fluttering wildly and weakly. She loosened Nora's collar so she could breathe more easily, tilted the girl's head to one side in the proper position, then spoke softly to reassure her, telling Nora to look into her eyes and try to breathe slowly to the rhythm Ruth counted. The girl gripped Ruth's hand as if clinging to the last life raft in the middle of a deep sea, her eyes still wide with terror, but she held on to Ruth's gaze and fought to endure. Ruth knew very well that what she was doing was only a temporary measure to hold Nora there, that the only thing that could truly save her now was the correct medicine Celeste had switched, the very thing Ruth couldn't possibly get inside this locked room. The girl's crisis was waiting to flare at any moment. Her skin was growing colder, and her fingers had begun to tremble in waves. But the breathing Ruth was struggling to maintain was still there, fragile, but not yet gone. She understood that she couldn't rely on her bare hands forever. She needed help, needed medicine, needed someone with enough power to tear through every barrier surrounding the two girls. And there was only one person in the world who had all of those things. Ruth slipped her hand into the pocket of her apron and pulled out her phone, her trembling fingers moving quickly across the screen to find the name she knew was the only hope left in this night. Across the city, inside a cold warehouse at the Eastern Dock, Wesley Kane was sitting across from a group of people he had to negotiate with in order to settle the disputed shipment, the air stretched tight like a violin string about to snap, every word heavy with calculation. Just as the conversation was reaching its most dangerous point, the phone in his coat pocket vibrated, and on the screen appeared a name he had never once seen calling him before, the name of the new maid who had been working in his house. Wesley froze for a beat, because in the nearly half a year Ruth had worked under his roof, she had never once called his private number. The instinct of a man who had lived through too much told him something was wrong. He lifted a hand to signal for the whole room to be silent, ignoring the irritated frown of the man across from him at being interrupted, then pressed the phone to his ear. Ruth's voice came through, broken and trembling but clear in every word, telling him that Nora was in critical condition, that the girl's heart was weakening very quickly, and that Celeste was the one who had attacked his sister. For one moment, the entire world around Wesley seemed to sink into silence. The blood in his body turned cold, his ears rang, and all he could hear was the frantic pounding of his own heart. He gripped the phone so tightly it seemed ready to shatter, his voice dropping into a register so cold that the men seated around the table shuddered, and he asked Ruth whether she was certain of what she had just said. Ruth answered that she had seen it with her own eyes, that she was barricaded inside the room with Nora, and was doing everything she could to hold on. But the girl needed the correct medicine, and needed him home right now, or it wouldn't be in time. Wesley didn't ask another question. He shot to his feet so abruptly that the chair crashed to the floor, swept every unfinished negotiation aside, threw the stunned men one sentence that the meeting ended here, then strode toward the door with the speed of a beast that had just heard its own child cry for help. He rushed into the car, ordered the driver to race back to the mansion as fast as possible, and as the vehicle roared through the city night, two opposing scenes wove into each other. In the locked room on the hill, Ruth was still kneeling before Nora, her mouth never stopping as she counted each breath for the girl to cling to. One hand pressed against the chest, rising and falling so weakly, her ears still clearly hearing Celeste's furious hissing behind the door. On the sloping road leading down from the harbor, Wesley sat in the back seat, with his jaw clenched tight, the streetlights flashing across his hardened face, and in his mind there was only the image of his sister's pleading eyes, the eyes he had unknowingly failed to see for so long. He blamed himself for trusting Celeste's gentle mask too much, for letting work sweep him away until he had failed to recognize that right beneath his own roof, his sister had been crying out for help in silence. Every second that passed on the road stretched as long as a century. Every turn made his heart tighten with the fear that he wouldn't make it home in time. In the small room, Ruth felt Nora's hand growing colder in hers, and she bent down to whisper to the girl that she had to hold on. Her brother was almost home. She only needed to stay strong a little longer. Two roads, two people, bound by the same urgent heartbeat moving toward one life, wavering on the line between life and death, and both of them knew that tonight would decide everything. When Wesley's convoy tore through the iron gate and braked hard in front of the mansion steps, he could already see the house blazing with light and hear the commotion spilling down from the second floor. But Celeste was cunning, and in the short stretch of time between Ruth's phone call and his arrival, she had managed to stage a perfect performance to turn the entire situation upside down. She had called several servants who owed her favors and obeyed her up to the second floor, sobbing pitifully as she told them that Ruth, the maid, had broken into Nora's room in the middle of the night, struggled with the girl and caused her to have an attack, then barricaded herself in the bathroom and refused to let anyone in so she could hide what she had done. The moment Wesley stepped into the hallway, Celeste rushed over and clung to his arm, tears streaming down her face, trembling as she told him that she had caught Ruth rummaging through Nora's belongings and stealing several precious pieces of jewelry, and that when she discovered it and tried to stop her, the maid panicked, shoved Nora, and caused the girl to fall and suffer a heart attack. The servants behind her all nodded in agreement. One claimed they had seen Ruth run into the room with a sneaky look. Another said they had heard the sounds of struggling and objects crashing to the floor. One even held out a bracelet they claimed had fallen from Ruth's apron pocket while she was fighting, a piece of evidence Celeste had planted in advance to drive the maid into a corner with no way out. What lay before Wesley now was a chaotic scene, his fiancée sobbing in his arms as she accused the maid, a group of servants noisily giving testimony, and behind the locked bathroom door stood the accused girl, holding his sister in her arms. The rage and terror that had been building inside him all the way home made his mind spin. And in that moment, even a man as sharp as Wesley had his vision covered by the net of lies thrown over him. He slammed his hand against the door and ordered the person inside to unlock it immediately. Inside, Ruth heard his voice and the accusations echoing in, and her heart tightened because she understood that Celeste had moved one step ahead of her. Trembling, she opened the lock and carried Nora out in her arms. The instant Wesley saw his sister lying limp in the maid's hold, her face white as paper and her lips turning blue, he felt as if an invisible hand had closed around his chest and squeezed the breath from him. In that panic tangled with fury, the look he gave Ruth was full of suspicion and coldness. Through clenched teeth, he asked what she had done to his sister, why she had locked herself in the room, and whether what Celeste had said was true. Ruth shook her head desperately. She tried to explain that Celeste was the one who had switched Nora's medicine, that she had locked the door to protect the girl from her, but her voice broke apart beneath Celeste's crying and the accusations from the servants. Celeste immediately cut in, wiping her tears as she asked in a voice thick with wounded outrage, where a poor, lowly maid, who had only recently started working here, could possibly find a reason to slander the woman who was about to become the mistress of this house, unless she was making up stories to deny her own theft and assault. Ruth looked around and saw every pair of eyes fixed on her with doubt. She saw the man she had just placed her final hope in, now looking at her as though she were a traitor, and she felt the ground beneath her feet collapse. She turned to Nora for help, but the girl was now so exhausted that she couldn't even lift her hand, her eyes half closed and her breathing as thin as a thread, completely without enough strength left to make even one sign to clear the name of the person who had risked herself to protect her. In that suffocating room, Ruth stood alone in a ring of lies, clutching the mute girl who was barely clinging to life, and for the first time since the night began, she felt despair rise all the way to her throat because the truth was right there in her hands. Yet no one was willing to believe it. Just when every word had become meaningless and the truth seemed about to be buried beneath Celeste's layers of lies, a faint movement from Nora made everyone freeze. The girl, barely breathing in Ruth's arms, suddenly gathered every last bit of strength left in her ruined body, her trembling hands fumbling toward the bed, where the old stuffed animal she hugged every night lay quietly on the pillow. Everyone in the room stared in confusion, not understanding what she was trying to do, while Celeste's face briefly went pale as she sensed that something had slipped beyond her control. Nora slid her hand into a worn seam along the stuffed animal's back and pulled out from inside the padding a small phone, not the familiar phone she always used to type in front of everyone, but another device she had secretly hidden for a long time. With fingers so weak they seemed almost numb, she touched the screen, opened an audio recording that had already been recorded, then used her final fading breath to hold it out toward her brother, her tear-filled eyes fixed on Wesley as if she wanted to tell him that this was what she had been trying to say to him all this time. Wesley took the phone from his sister's weakening hand, and when the video began to play, the entire room sank into a silence so heavy it felt hard to breathe. Through the speaker, Celeste's real voice echoed clearly in the room, her tone twisted without even a trace of false gentleness left, bending over his mute sister and spilling out the cruel words she had thought no one would ever know. The voice in the recording coldly insulted Nora, calling her a burden, an obstacle on Celeste's path into the Kane family, threatening that one day the girl would disappear from this house and no one would feel the slightest grief. The audio also captured the sound of Celeste roughly swatting Nora's hand away each time the girl tried to ask for help, and the way she waited for the moments when Wesley was away from home to pour her cruelty onto the girl behind that carefully worn mask. Word after word, sentence after sentence, everything was laid bare before the most powerful man on the harbor. And with every second that passed, Wesley's face changed, from doubt to shock, from shock to pain, and then from pain into a cold, bone-deep fury. He realized that through all these months, every time his sister had clutched his sleeve with desperate eyes, every time she had trembled while trying to type a line only to be interrupted by Celeste, those were the moments she had been screaming for help in silence, and he had unknowingly turned away from them. He realized that his fragile little sister had been forced to live in fear right under the roof that should have been the safest place in the world, had been forced to quietly gather evidence by hiding a phone inside a stuffed animal, because that was the only way a girl who couldn't raise her voice could protect herself. Wesley dropped to his knees beside the bed, pulled his sister into his arms. And for the first time in his life, that iron-hearted man let tears run freely down his face. He whispered a choked apology into her ear, apologizing for not listening, apologizing for leaving her to fight alone for so long, apologizing because he had nearly believed the very person who had deliberately tried to harm her. Then he lifted his head and looked at Ruth, the woman he had been staring at with suspicion only minutes earlier, and in that instant he understood that this poor maid was the only person who had truly seen his sister as a human being, the only one who hadn't turned away when everyone else had been deceived. His eyes held both gratitude and deep remorse, an apology left unspoken, but one Ruth understood completely. The moment the video ended, Celeste knew she had been driven into a corner. She hurriedly backed toward the door, her face white as ash, her mouth stammering denials as she claimed the footage had been edited, that the maid and the mute girl had conspired to stage it all in order to destroy her. But Nora still hadn't let go of the phone, and with the last scraps of strength left in her, the girl touched the screen one more time, opening not another video but a long chain of messages she had accidentally captured during the days she lay sick, when Celeste had thought she was lost in sleep and carelessly exposed the screen of her own phone. Wesley took the device, his eyes moving over each line, and the more he read, the darker his face became, like the sky before a storm. Those messages were a secret exchange between Celeste and a name Wesley knew far too well, Roland Pike, the leader of the rival force that had always watched for a chance to swallow the Kane Empire whole. It turned out the woman he was about to marry didn't merely hate his sister, she was also playing a calculated double game. In those messages, Celeste agreed to feed Roland confidential information about transportation routes, business connections, and weak points in the Kane system, in exchange for a massive sum of money transferred into her private account. She wrote that she wasn't sure she could actually marry Wesley, because he was too busy and too cold, and because he was still burdened by the sickly little sister she despised, so she had to secure an escape route for herself. She calculated that if her plan to enter the Kane family succeeded, she would seize the entire fortune, and if it failed, at least she would have already scraped together enough money from Roland to disappear far away. Nora's death, in her cold calculation, was only one step toward clearing the obstacle from both of those paths. When Wesley understood the whole truth, he felt a chill run down his spine, not from fear, but from utter disgust. He realized he had been betrayed not just once but twice, deceived by the woman who stood beside him every day inside his own home, and he had almost handed both his family and his life's work over to someone who had been quietly selling him out to his enemy. The man who had always remained calm and in control of everything now rose to his full height, set the phone down with terrible gentleness, and when he turned to look at Celeste, there was no warmth left in his eyes, only the coldness of a man who had completely seen through the true face of the person standing before him. Celeste backed up until she hit the wall, every excuse strangled in her throat beneath that stare. Wesley spoke, his voice low and slow, but every word seemed carved into stone. He said he had forgiven many people for their mistakes, but he had never forgiven, and would never forgive, anyone who dared lay a hand on his own blood in exchange for money. He ordered his guards to block every exit of the mansion, and not allow her to take a single step out of his sight. Celeste screamed and begged, changing her tone as she pleaded that she was only a victim Roland had forced into obedience, but no one in the room believed even one word from her anymore. In the middle of the fury rising inside him, Wesley still didn't forget the most important thing. He glanced at his sister, who was fading in Ruth's arms, and understood that the reckoning with the traitors could wait, but Nora's life couldn't wait another second. At the very moment Wesley finished giving the order to seal off the mansion, a faint sound from Nora made everyone's heart seem to stop, the sound of the phone slipping from the girl's hand and falling onto the mattress, followed by the way her body suddenly went limp in Ruth's arms. The maid bent down in a rush, pressed her ear to the girl's chest, and her face instantly changed when she could no longer hear any heartbeat, only a terrifying silence where there should have been the sound of life. Ruth screamed that Nora's heart had stopped, that the girl wasn't breathing anymore, and that scream pulled Wesley out of his fury and threw him straight into the greatest horror of his life. Unlike the crisis before, when the girl's heart had still been fluttering wildly and her breath had still been faintly clinging on, this was a complete collapse, the thinnest boundary between life and death. But Ruth didn't allow herself to panic. The instinct of someone who had once been trained in nursing rose up stronger than ever, and she immediately laid Nora properly on the floor where there was a firm, flat surface, stacked both hands over the center of the girl's chest, and began pressing down in steady, decisive rhythms while shouting for everyone to call the medical team at once. Wesley didn't hesitate for even a second. He pulled out his phone and called the private doctors that a man in his position always kept stationed near the house for family emergencies, ordering them to come immediately with all their emergency equipment. While they waited, with every second stretching endlessly, Ruth never stopped. She performed chest compressions in a steady rhythm, then bent down to breathe air into the girl, sweat breaking across her forehead. But her hands didn't tremble at all, because she knew that if she paused for even one beat, that fragile thread of life might snap completely. Wesley knelt beside her, gripping his sister's ice-cold hand, his mouth calling her name again and again, the voice of that iron-hearted man breaking into trembling pleas he had never once spoken before anyone in his life. Only a few minutes later, the medical team rushed in with a stretcher, an oxygen tank, and a defibrillator. They quickly took control of the scene, while Ruth moved back to make room. Yet she remained kneeling close beside them to assist, her hand still holding Wesley's, as though she were helping him cling to hope. The lead doctor swiftly attached the electrodes to the girl's chest, his eyes fixed on the monitor where only a lifeless straight line ran across the screen. He called out for the shock to be prepared, and ordered everyone to stand clear. The sharp whine of the machine charging filled the room, then the first shock passed through Nora's small body, making her lift slightly, but the straight line on the screen remained quietly unchanged. The entire room held its breath. Wesley squeezed Ruth's hand so tightly it hurt, his eyes pinned to the monitor, begging for some sign of life. The doctor raised the charge, shouted for everyone to stand clear again, and the second shock passed through her. But still, only cruel silence answered. Ruth felt tears spill from her eyes, but she bit her lip and refused to let herself collapse. She whispered a prayer and softly called the girl's name, begging her not to let go, begging her to stay with the people who still needed her so desperately. The doctor injected a heart-stimulating medication, then raised the charge one final time. He said this was the last chance, and the whole room poured every remaining fragile hope into that fateful shock. When the current passed through her, Nora's body lifted slightly, then fell back down, and for a moment that seemed to stretch through eternity, nothing happened at all, only the steady sound of the machine and the held breaths of everyone around her. Then suddenly, on the monitor, a tiny line flickered upward, followed by a faint beep, then another, and then another, each fragile heartbeat beginning to knock its way back like life itself finding the door home. The doctor cried out that the girl's heart had started beating again, that her pulse had returned even though it was still very weak, and the whole room broke open into choked breaths of relief. Nora slowly parted her eyes, and the first image that entered her blurred vision was the tear-soaked face of her brother bending over her, beside the maid who had fought death itself and won her back. While Nora was moved by the medical team into a quiet room for monitoring and recovery, with Ruth staying beside her and not leaving even half a step, Roland Pike, on the other side of the city, had already sensed that his plan was falling apart. He knew that once the messages recording the agreement between him and Celeste fell into Wesley's hands, it would be no different from a death sentence hanging over his head, because not only would the plot to take over the Kane family be exposed, but his entire underground business network would also be in danger of collapsing with it. As a man used to acting before his opponent had time to make a countermove, Roland immediately sent a team of his men to storm the Kane warehouse by the harbor that very night, the place where important documents and ledgers were kept, intending to seize or burn every piece of evidence that could incriminate him before Wesley had the chance to use it. But he had badly underestimated the man he was trying to outmaneuver. The moment Wesley grasped the full truth from Nora's phone, he had already anticipated that Roland would act recklessly to cut off the trail, and he had quietly stationed men to guard the key locations, while ordering a group of his most trusted guards to the warehouse to set a trap in advance, refusing to leave his sister's bedside. When Roland's men broke in under cover of darkness, believing they would easily succeed, they were stunned to realize they had walked straight into the net Wesley had laid for them. The lights in the warehouse blazed on, and Wesley's right-hand man stepped out of the shadows with a composure cold enough to chill the blood, standing among the towering stacks of crates, as if he were standing in the middle of his own untouchable territory. In a calm, low voice, he told the men that they had chosen the wrong place to step into, and that the man who had sent them there didn't even have the courage to show his own face. The confrontation erupted inside the vast warehouse, but it wasn't a bloody brawl. It was a display of overwhelming force in both strategy and presence. Wesley's men, well trained and familiar with every corner of the place, quickly gained the upper hand, sealing off every exit and subduing each intruder one by one with clean, decisive control. The trusted lieutenant moved through the struggle with the calm of a man who already held victory in his hand, issuing commands through brief gestures, directing his men to surround and capture the enemy, without allowing the situation to spiral beyond control. He didn't allow the clash to become a tragedy, because what he wanted wasn't destruction, but the complete submission of those who had dared set foot in his territory. One by one, Roland's men were disarmed and forced to surrender, driven into a corner of the warehouse under the strict watch of the Kane guards. When the leader of the intruders realized that the plan had failed completely and that every path of retreat had been cut off, he dropped his weapon in resignation, understanding that he had fallen into the hands of an opponent far greater than the man who had ordered him there. He stepped up in front of the leader of the intruders, looked straight into his eyes, and told him to deliver a message to Roland Pike from Wesley Kane, stating that anyone who dared touch his family, anyone who dared use the weak to carry out a filthy scheme, would pay the price to the very end, not through blind violence, but through the very rules Wesley would impose on him. Throughout that entire confrontation, not once was Nora's name or her fragile figure dragged into it, because Wesley had given an absolute order to keep his sister and Ruth in the safest place, completely far away from every danger and every act of violence, so those two young women would have to focus only on fighting their way back to life. When everything in the warehouse had been brought fully under control and the space returned to stillness, the right-hand man immediately called Wesley to report that the threat had been neutralized. He understood that subduing this group of men was only the first step, that the true mastermind behind it all was still out there, unpunished, and that both Roland and Celeste would have to face consequences equal to what they had done. But he also knew that the proper punishment for people like them wasn't found in fists or bullets, but in something else, something that would strip them of everything they had ever relied on and desired. He took out his phone and began arranging the final move, the move that would close this entire tragedy in a way no traitor could ever have expected. Wesley understood that a man like Roland Pike would never truly fall because of fists or bullets, because he was far too used to living among violence and always knew how to crawl his way out of bloody confrontations. But there was one thing he couldn't possibly withstand, and that was having every one of his sins dragged into the light, while the people who had once knelt at his feet turned their backs on him and walked away. Instead of rushing into a war that would damage both sides, Wesley chose a calmer path, but one many times more devastating. He gathered all the evidence Nora had bravely collected, from the dark messages of agreement between Celeste and Roland, to the documents proving the plot to take over the Kane family and the illegal deals Roland had kept hidden for so long, then copied them into multiple sets and handed them over to the most trustworthy people of authority in the city. People Roland couldn't bribe or threaten. At the same time, he carefully allowed evidence of Roland's betrayal to reach the ears of Roland's own closest allies and most trusted subordinates. When his business partners realized Roland was the kind of man willing to betray even the person sharing his pillow for profit, when the men beneath him understood that their leader had been backed into a dead end and no longer had the ability to protect anyone, the empire he had spent so much effort building began to crack, then crumble from within. One by one, people left him. One by one, the doors that had once opened for him slammed shut, and in only a short time, the man who had once watched for a chance to swallow the Kane family whole suddenly became a lonely outcast, rejected by his own side. When the authorities followed that undeniable trail of evidence and tightened the net around him, Roland realized he had lost in a way more blatant and humiliating than any failure of his life. He hadn't fallen beneath the gun barrel of an enemy, but had been dragged into the abyss by his own greed and betrayal, forced to face the law and pay for every crime he had committed behind bars. As for Celeste, her collapse was no less bitter. The woman who had once dreamed of stepping into the Kane family to seize the entire fortune now had her true face stripped bare before everyone she had deceived. Wesley announced the end of the engagement immediately, and he did it not in a noisy burst of anger, but with a cold finality far more frightening than any shout. He looked straight into her eyes and said she had lost everything with her own hands, not because she lacked beauty or cunning, but because she had chosen to target the weakest and most innocent person in this house to satisfy her own greed, and that was a sin he would never let pass. All the evidence of Celeste's actions, from switching Nora's medicine in an attempt to harm her to conspiring to sell out the Kane family, was handed over to law enforcement. She was stripped of everything she had ever desired, lost the ticket into high society that she had traded her conscience to pursue, and had to face serious charges in court. The servants who had gone along with her and helped accuse Ruth falsely also bowed their heads and admitted their wrongs. Some were dismissed, while others trembled as they begged for forgiveness after realizing they had nearly driven an innocent person to her death. Wesley didn't need to fire a single shot, didn't need to stain his hands with blood, and still he made both people who had dared touch his family pay the highest price, losing everything they had ever possessed and ever dreamed of, while also bearing the just punishment of the law. When everything came to an end, people feared the Cain name even more, not because of brutality, but because of the wisdom and absolute authority of the man at its head, a man who could crush his enemies without resorting to blind violence. But amid all those calculations and all that power, the thing that lightened Wesley's heart most wasn't his victory over Roland or Celeste's downfall, but the fact that his sister was finally safe and that the people who had made her live in fear would never be able to touch her again. The days after that fateful night passed in an entirely different atmosphere, and the mansion on the hill, once cold and filled with calculation, slowly grew warm again with each beat of Nora's recovery. Her fragile heart, after being won back from the hands of death, gradually found its steady rhythm again, thanks to the devoted care of the medical team and Ruth's hand that never once left her side. Each day, Nora grew a little stronger. A faint blush began to return to her pale cheeks, and the smile she had hidden for so long behind fear could finally bloom fully. Wesley set aside almost all his work to stay with his sister, sitting for hours beside her bed, something he had never allowed himself to do before, because he had always used busyness as an excuse. One afternoon, while Nora was drifting off to sleep, Wesley accidentally found a thick stack of papers in the drawer of his sister's desk. They were the pages Nora had written throughout all that time, but had never had the chance to place in his hands. He sat down in silence and read them line by line, and every sentence felt like a knife twisting into his heart. In them, she wrote about the loneliness of watching him hurry away day after day without even having time to look back. Wrote about the fear she felt whenever Celeste entered the room while he was away. Wrote about the simple longing for him to sit beside her just a little longer and listen to the things she couldn't speak aloud. There were lines where she wrote that she didn't blame him, that she understood he carried a tremendous burden on his shoulders. But sometimes she only wished she could make a sound just once, if only to call his name. Reading that, the most powerful man on the harbor, the man who had just brought an entire rival force to its knees without firing a single shot, lowered his head onto the pages and wept like a child. He realized that for all these years, he had thought he was protecting his sister by building walls of power and wealth around her. But what Nora had needed most had never been any of those things. It had simply been the presence and listening heart of the only brother she had in this world. Then his eyes turned toward Ruth, who was quietly changing the warm towel for Nora in the corner of the room. He remembered everything. He remembered that in an entire house full of people, only this poor maid had been willing to stop long enough to read his sister's words. Only she had not looked at Nora as a sick young lady who needed to be served, but as a human being with feelings, with pain, and with a voice of her own, even if that voice couldn't rise into sound. In one conversation, Ruth softly told him why she could understand Nora so deeply. She told him that years ago, when her mother became gravely ill and lay bedridden, there were periods when the woman was so weak she couldn't speak at all and could only look at Ruth with weary eyes. And it was during those months that Ruth learned that a single gaze could hold 1,000 unspoken words. That people who couldn't raise their voices didn't have nothing to say. They were only waiting for someone patient enough to listen. She said that when she looked into Nora's eyes, she felt as though she were seeing her own mother again, and she couldn't turn away from a soul so desperate to be understood. Wesley listened to that story as deep admiration and gratitude surged through his heart. He understood that the young woman standing before him, though seen by the world as lowly, possessed a heart more noble than anyone he had ever met in his world full of schemes and calculation. He realized that it was Ruth's quiet kindness, not his power or his money, that had saved his sister and redeemed this entire family. And in that moment, a new and lasting bond began to form among three people who had once stood so far apart in life. As time slowly passed, the Cain mansion was no longer a place that imprisoned silent fears, but had become a true home. Wesley decided to keep Ruth there, not as a maid anymore, but in a position far more dignified. He invited her to become Nora's official companion and caregiver, someone both he and his sister trusted and cherished, like a blood member of the family. Ruth, the young woman who had grown up among loss and loneliness, who had once believed she would spend her whole life standing at the edge of other people's lives, now felt for the first time what it meant to truly belong somewhere. She and Nora grew closer with each passing day, two souls who had once carried fragile and uncertain fates, now leaning on each other to find joy and peace. Nora recovered day by day. She began to smile more often, began going with Ruth into the sun-filled garden behind the house to breathe the clean air, and whenever she typed a cheerful line on her phone screen, both Wesley and Ruth would stop and listen completely, never again allowing her to feel that her voice had been missed. Wesley had changed too. That powerful man learned that true strength didn't lie in how many enemies he could bring to their knees, but in whether he was willing to stop and listen to the weakest people beside him. Their story closes with a simple yet profound lesson, that the worth of a human being has never been measured by whether they are healthy or sick, perfect or imperfect, useful or a burden in someone else's eyes, but by the dignity that belongs to them simply because they are human. The vulnerable, the ones who can't raise their own voices to defend themselves, aren't people who deserve to be abandoned or looked down upon. On the contrary, they deserve even more to be heard, protected, and cherished. And sometimes, the strongest person isn't the one with the most power or wealth, but the one with enough patience and love to bend down and listen to a silent voice the whole world has carelessly forgotten. The kindness of a poor maid proved that goodness doesn't distinguish between rich and poor, noble and lowly, and that as long as one person is willing to open their heart and see another person's pain, it is enough to light a flame in the darkest corners of life. If this story has touched your heart, please leave a like and share it with more people so kindness can spread far and wide. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so we can keep listening together to many more moving and meaningful stories every day. How do you feel about the story of Ruth, Nora, and Wesley? Have you ever met someone in your life who was willing to listen to you even when you couldn't put your feelings into words? Please leave a comment and share the feelings from deep within your heart so we and everyone else can listen together. Thank you for taking the time to follow this story until the very last moment. May you and your loved ones always have abundant health, overflowing joy, and a truly peaceful life every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next stories.